Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. One of the more significant fights that will happen in the heavyweight division this year that's really had very little coverage is the IBF final eliminator between Kubrat Pulev and Hughie Fury on October the 27th. And this video isn't so much about that fight itself, rather the ramifications that stem from it. What's on the line is a title shot against the IBF champion, which is Anthony Joshua. And there seems to be a bit of a narrative floating around some fans that Joshua's next few fights, if a Wilder fight doesn't happen, is going to be a procession of Dillian Whyte, Jarrell Miller, and Alexander Usyk. And Usyk is in the mix because he's currently WBO Super Champion, and that means he can get a shot at the WBO champion in the division immediately above, and that is obviously Joshua. He'll keep that status if he beats Tony Bellew in November. But the part of the next 12 months that has seemingly been forgotten is this whole Pulev and Fury fight. That's going to establish the IBF mandatory challenger. And the one thing that we know about the IBF is it enforces its mandatories. A challenger will get their title shot. And given the last IBF mandatory challenge was in October 2017, that was Carlos Takam, a late replacement for Kubrat Pulev to face Joshua, it's more than likely that the IBF is going to order Joshua fight the winner of Pulev and Fury within 6 to 9 months, max. And that's probably even taking into account any exception it may grant. And an exception might be a Wilder fight, or potentially a voluntary. But the IBF isn't going to just muck around and say, yeah, you can have as long as you want. And if Joshua doesn't do what the IBF says in the time frame that it ultimately sets, he gets stripped. Simple as that. And I can't really see him wanting to entertain that possibility. After all, he wants to be the undisputed champion. He's wanting to create some legacy, defend his belts. The only instance in which I could really see him being willing to drop the IBF belt is if it was for a Deontay Wilder fight, which, if that fight happened, more than likely the IBF is probably going to back that unification fight, as it would create a rare piece of undisputed history. Not many times have we seen an undisputed heavyweight champion in the last 20 years. In fact, the last time it was 15 or 16 years ago. But outside of a Wilder fight, taking into account the IBF strap was also the first that Joshua picked up. That was back in 2016 versus Charles Martin. I just can't see him ditching the belt just on a whim to go off and fight someone like Jarrell Miller. Why would he do that? Arguably, Kubrat Pulev, Hughie Fury, they're on the same level as Miller anyway. There is no more interest for a Jarrell Miller fight than there is for a Hughie Fury or Kubrat Pulev fight. And if he can face his mandatory, keep his belt, why wouldn't he do that? So with all that said, I do actually expect the IBF to be out publicly shortly after October the 27th, that's when the Pulev and Fury fight is, ordering its mandatory challenger to face Joshua. Or at the very least, they'll be giving an update or some guidance on the what next. And don't rule out the outside chance that Joshua will have to face Pulev or Fury on April 13th at Wembley. Because the longer the negotiations that Eddie Hearn says are going on with Deontay Wilder, the more likely that scenario becomes. Because if they can't get a fight done with Deontay Wilder for April, then obviously they have to look at the what next. And say negotiations don't end well with Hearn and whoever he's negotiating with or says he's negotiating with, and it's all of a sudden the middle of December. The IBF may just say no to any exception request from Matchroom to allow Joshua to fight voluntary Dillian Whyte or whoever for April. Eddie Hearn may already have a request in for a voluntary fight, another challenger already. There is no guarantee that the IBF will grant that. And Eddie Hearn, he does like to finesse these situations with mandatories. He likes to talk up Dillian Whyte being the favourite after Wilder because he's looking at the what next. He's looking at the option of selling that fight because that is the option after Wilder. And he has to actually actively manage that situation because if a Wilder fight doesn't happen, he has to go to his plan B. But he doesn't have control over what the IBF does. And he doesn't control the IBF. And that's the risk guys like Dillian Whyte and Jarrell Miller voluntarily and willingly took on when they blew off IBF-ordered eliminators against Pulev to go face other opponents. And for Whyte it was a money fight versus Joseph Parker, that was in July. And for Jarrell Miller, he blew off Pulev to face a cherry pick in Thomas Adamek, and that was just in early October. So while their bank balances may be healthier right now as a result of their choices, Whyte and Miller are not a lock to get a Joshua fight next year. Despite what some people are saying, there is no guarantees, and Miller even less so. You can make a case for Whyte that after a Wilder fight, if the IBF does grant an exception, the other sanctioning bodies grant an exception, if in fact Eddie Hearn has to apply to them, then a Dillian Whyte fight is possible, or more than possible, for April. But in Miller's case, not so much. He's already admitted he's not going to be the guy likely to be in the running for April, and he's chasing a WBA regular title fight in the meantime. And he's indicated his shot should be in later in 2019, and he thinks that's when he'll get his turn against Joshua. And I'm just not convinced at all, especially when you consider Joshua's got 3 belts, and with that, mandatory considerations become an ongoing issue. It's hard to just fight endless voluntaries and take care of your mandatories at the same time. I just can't see Joshua being able to squeeze in 2 voluntary defenses in 2019. If you look at it logically, with everything that could happen, it's very unlikely in my view, especially with the IBF mandatory floating around and the potential for Alexander Usyk to exercise his WBO super champion status at cruiserweight to get an immediate shot at Joshua. And if a Deontay Wilder fight does happen in April, let's hope it does, there's going to be no voluntary defenses next year because a rematch would be likely kicking in immediately after the first fight. Or at the very least, the winner would be ordered to face the IBF mandatory or face being stripped of that belt. That could happen, and we've seen it happen before. Cast your mind back, Tyson Fury, upon signing again to fight Vladimir Klitschko in the rematch, stripped of his belt. So it could and probably will end up happening again if the mandatory isn't taken care of sooner rather than later. The risk is, you let that dangle out there for a time, they'll take it away. It's just not going to let promoters dictate when it's mandatory fights. It won't go through 2019 not letting whoever the winner of Pulev Fury is not getting their title shot. So that fight, October the 27th, expect some news shortly after. So there could potentially be some rougher waters ahead for Anthony Joshua and his promoter Eddie Hearn to negotiate if he's to hold on to all of his belts. And this has always been the issue, and part of the reason why Vladimir Klitschko in his lengthy run as heavyweight champion had 3 belts, had to just basically fight mandatory after mandatory after mandatory. And Joshua, he says he wants to keep his belts, he wants to face his mandatories, but we'll have to see what happens. But the winner of the Pulev and Fury fight, no doubt they're going to feel in a pretty good spot to get their title shot in 2019, potentially sooner rather than later. So in hindsight, with all that being said, and the IBF looking to protect its mandatory challenger, protect their position to get that fight, you got to wonder, guys like Jarrell Miller, who blew it off, he didn't want to go to Bulgaria, and Dillian Whyte, who took a 7-figure payday to fight Joseph Parker, if they don't get a title shot in 2019, do you think they'll be kicking themselves? Or is Dillian Whyte laughing all the way to the bank? Jarrell Miller, probably not so much. But yeah, I have to wonder about that because at the time it was like, well, if you fight this guy, you beat him. It might be in Bulgaria, but you beat him. You're locked in for a title shot. No one can take that away. Whereas for a voluntary, with mandatory considerations and potential unification on the line, you end up being at the whim of the boxing gods. So there is a question to be asked, should one of them have gone for the smaller money, taken the risk, and locked that in? I mean, it's easy to say that now, but then again, we were saying that at the time. A lot of us were saying, look, take this shot, you can get your shot. But, the IBF, it could be the fly in the ointment for a few guys, the challengers, but also for Anthony Joshua if he wants to hold on to that strap. It's going to be an interesting 6 to 9 months, no doubt. Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter. Boxing_squared. That's boxing_squared. I'm out. If you want even more boxing content, come and join me on Patreon. Every week on a Sunday, I drop a new video on something topical or thought-provoking from the heavyweight division, ranging from rankings, the business of boxing, the false economy of deluded fanboys, the twists and turns in the division, to assessments of fighters and their statements. I hope to see you there, and for more information go to patreon.com/boxing squared. The address is on screen now.